I think for the introduction, what I'm mainly going to do is just set up how the modes of production debate has developed from Marx up until this most recent iteration, which has been really led by two Byzantinists, or at least the key works have been done by two Byzantinists, John Haldon and Jairus Banaji. And then the further reading stuff is if hopefully this webinar means that you're really excited about trying to figure out how modes of production can be useful heuristics, and you go off and want to read more things. So I can give a little bit of indication about why I chose these different ones, but they're just there if this interests you a lot. So the background to modes of production as a heuristic, like the whole of the Marxist or historical materialist tradition, is the work of Marx and also Engels, but here particularly the work of early Marx. So I chose two texts that to illustrate this. The first was the Theses on Feuerbach, which are very 10 short notes and an 11th sort of programmatic commandment, written in the mid-1840s by Marx and sort of subsequently interpreted by the Marxist tradition as marking the real break, sometimes called an epistemological break in Marx's thinking from his previous sort of radical liberal Democrat and Hegelian materialist, Hegelian idealist thinking with Feuerbach, and then a rupture from that older thinking, and then the beginning of a new conception of the world or worldview. And then the second Marx text that I chose for the background is the 1859 preface to a contribution to the critique of political economy, which isn't the first place that that modes of production comes about in Marx's writings as we have them now, but is the first place that most people who are reading Marx at the time and up to 1932 and then 1939 really would have been able to engage with these ideas of Marx. Primarily because one earlier text, also written around the same time as Theses on Feuerbach, the German ideology, wasn't published in Marx's lifetime. They couldn't find a publisher for it, Marx and Engels, and so it wasn't published until 1932. And also the notebook that Marx was using in 1857, 1858, which is called the Grundrisse, which means fundament. It's the fundament to a critique of political economy, and that wasn't published until 1939. So, but even though those texts are slightly earlier and in some ways richer in their engaging with these same topics than the 1859 preface, I've chosen that because of this publication history. It's ended up being a lot more influential on how modes of production as a way of thinking developed. So the reason I chose Theses on Feuerbach, as I said, is because this is really where the historical materialist worldview starts to emerge out of the previous traditions that Marx had been working in, and particularly for our questions here, particularly important are the claims made in Thesis 1 and Thesis 5. Sorry, not Thesis 5, Thesis 6. So in Thesis 1, Marx explaining how materialism prior to himself has been a very objectivist. It only conceives of materiality in the objective thing, or the form of the object, but it doesn't conceive of materiality or materialism as sensuous human activity, practice, which means a combination of thought and action. And in fact, in this sort of duality between materialist philosophy and idealist philosophy, the understanding of activity, of human sensuousness had been developed by idealism, somewhat ironically. So the first break is a departure from what we can call vulgar materialism, the idea that materiality is just the sort of basic stuff, and a move towards an understanding that materialism is practice. And then alongside this, this isn't individual practice understood individually, or practice understood as being determined by some reified transhistorical human nature. No, this is practice as it is mediated by social relations. So in the words of thesis 6, Feuerbach resolves the religious essence into the human essence, but which is talking about Feuerbach's own project to say that actually, if you look at these religious ideas, they're projections of human sociality. So they're projections of human nature. They're not really about the divine. But Marx takes this one step further and says, but the human essence isn't itself some abstraction that we all have, this permanent thing. Really, what we are, our human nature, is a reflection of the ensemble of social relations that we're part of. So really, thesis 1 and 6 in particular, and the theses on Feuerbach in general, are the starting point for what Gramsci called the philosophy of praxis, a conception of the world or a worldview predicated on the materiality of combined thought and action, which is always already interpersonal and relational. And so with this worldview, obviously, thesis 3 brings up the question of historical change. If our human essence isn't transhistorical or abstract, but is the ensemble of social relations, then history becomes particularly important, because you want to examine the character of those social relations, the way in which they're arranged, and what then kinds of humanity they produce. So in thesis 3, this is expressed in the idea that the changing of circumstances and upbringing defines us, and that we define them, that the educator has to themselves be educated. So this is the idea that there's a sort of intergenerational continuity of practice that creates this transformation over time and place. And that this consciousness of how we're changing our material circumstances and how we're inextricable from it is then what's presented as the definition of revolutionary practice. So the coincidence of the changing of circumstances and of human activity or self-changing can be conceived and rationally understood only as revolutionary practice. So already, although there's nothing strictly historical about the claims in the thesis on Feuerbach, you can see that this historical materialist worldview is bringing up that problematic of social relations, historical development over the long term, or historical materialism. And this I think, going to just picking up on the final thesis on Feuerbach, which is the famous statement, the philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it, which is the epitaph on Marx's grave in Highgate. The point here of the historical materialism is that if human nature is no longer transhistorical or predetermined, and if materiality is a combination of thought and action, then it means that the historical systems that we have, any given exploitative and dominating social system, as well as the corresponding human nature that emerges from it, is historically determined itself. It has dynamics, characteristics, trajectories, and a beginning, and therefore also an end. It can be overcome. We can overcome it with a freer and more equal alternative, precisely because it is a historical system. So I always think it's somewhat ironic, given that the most common sense claim refuting Marxism and communism, i.e. that it forgets about human nature, that actually right here in the sort of initial moment of Marxism coming together, human nature is dealt with in a much more critical and complex way than really many subsequent social theoretical traditions. So as I mentioned a bit earlier, this at the same time as the theses were being written, slightly just a few months later, Marx and Engels began writing a work called The German Ideology, which has a long section at the beginning, which is good to read for their conceptualization of the materialist method, if people are interested. But this wasn't actually published until 1932, so well after the Marxist tradition was already established. It had had several periods already by 1932. So the text in the German Ideology didn't impact classical Marxism and has had less of an impact, therefore, on subsequent modes of production theory, even after their publication. And the same goes, as I said, for the Grundrisse, but the Grundrisse also has a really interesting section at the beginning on the technique of political economy. So, so if people are interested in what Marx had to say about this, I'd really recommend that they go there. But the place that is first published that develops, that publicly develops this idea of the materialist conception of history is a short preface to the 1859 contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, which is one of the works and one of the more substantial works which Marx published in the lead up to Capital. So this starts with fairly famous statement that in the social production of their existence, men inevitably enter into definite relations which are independent of their will, namely relations of production appropriate to a given stage in the development of their material forces of production. So there are a lot of phrases there that even people who've never read this preface before will have come across in various ways. These three paragraphs are some of the most influential paragraphs in Marx. And we can see already that there's been a kind of shift again in the main language that's being used from the 1840s to the 1850s. By the end of the 1850s, the main language is less practice and more production. And they try to capture similar things, but there is a sort of slight qualitative difference in how they're being used. And especially this is social production. So the social production of life through social relations. And I think this brings up an interesting aspect of modes of production in general, then, which is that the mode of production isn't just about producing things itself, or even in the first instance, it's not about that at all, but about the way in which we produce and reproduce our lives, reproduce our existences. And so this then connects to the sensuous activity of the thesis on Feuerbach had spoken about, and this is reflected in the same paragraph, this first paragraph statement, that it isn't the consciousness of men that determines their existence, but their social existence that determines their consciousness. That captures a slightly different lens, maybe, or a slightly different aspect, but is the same idea as there is no inherent social nature, human nature rather. All human nature is the ensemble of social relations in a particular time and in a particular place. There are a few other interesting aspects of this paragraph that are important when we turn to the later traditions of modes of production theory. So the social relations which are said to make up this mode are called the relations of production, and these are paired dialectically with the forces of production. So the way that Marx puts it, the relations of production fit a given stage in the forces of production up until the point when they don't, and then they start to revolutionize these, and the whole mode of production starts to change. So you see already here one take on a theory of transition between different modes of production. And just to connect to some of the things that we were talking about last week, transition is a really key problematic that modes of production theory tries to capture. So not last week, the last meeting that we were having, but when we were talking about the determining role of capitalism on the ways in which we're framing our objects of study and approaching our academic work, that's a reflection of this idea that our consciousness comes about in a certain mode of production and material life, and that this then affects how we view the world. I'll come back to this problem of the relationship between the relations and the forces of production, but suffice it to say that obviously that does imply some kind of technological determinism, and there is also an implied kind of teleology between different modes here, which became an inheritance of the later tradition. Or not a but rather, the relations and the forces of production are then paired together and said to constitute the economic infrastructure, or the real foundation, the base, on which rises then the legal and political superstructure in society, and which definite forms of social consciousness respond to. So this is the place where the idea of a base in any given society, which is more strictly economic, and then superstructural parts of a given society which are less immediately economic, comes about from. This is maybe the key place that sets out that idea of base and superstructure. There are a few other places where it seems implicit in Marx's reasoning. There's a section in volume 3 of Capital, and also a footnote in volume 1, but really this is the place that it gets worked out as fully as it ever gets worked out, which is a key point I guess we'll return to, and that Wood really zones in on, that this isn't a full critical elaboration. This is a preface, but there is a sort of slight pushback against some of the most economistic readings possible of base and superstructure, in Marx saying that it's this consciousness. It's at this level of determined consciousness that we become aware of the conflicts that are going on in society and begin to fight it out. So there is an idea that the superstructure is important, but still that it's determined by the base. And so finally, we arrive at this vision of historical development of social relations through a succession of interrelated epochs, which are characterized by the dominance of various modes of production. Which is elaborated as the Asiatic, ancient, feudal, and modern bourgeois, or capitalist, we can say. But as I said, this is really 3 paragraphs of a preface. And ultimately, Marx only ever worked out one mode of production, the capitalist one, the modern bourgeois one. And even that, he wasn't able to fully work out on his own terms before he died, leaving Engels and Eleanor Marx to read his manuscripts and to finish it off. And this means that all of his categories, or as they appear in his developed work, like rent, merchant, finance and industrial capital, and so on, these were developed in the process of an analysis particular to the capitalist mode of production as Marx saw it. And although he does comment on other modes at different points, sometimes more kind of in their own right, they tend to be in introductory sections like this, or else they illustrate a contrast or development from the perspective of the capitalist mode of production. There are very few places, only a handful really, and none of them very long, where a pre-capitalist mode is dealt with on its own terms. So the challenge is whether an analysis as complex as Marx's for the capitalist mode is possible for other or previous modes, depending how you want to phrase it, and then how we would go about doing this, how we would go about building similarly critical materialist conceptions of historical social systems before capitalism. Something that would match up to the majesty of the 3 volumes of Capital. So in the subsequent development of the historical materialist tradition, and particularly what gets referred to as orthodoxy or orthodox Marxist-Leninist historical materialism, this is really defined by the way in which it emerged from first the generally quite economically reductivist versions of historical materialism in the Second International, so the historical materialisms of Kautsky and others in that pre-First World War period, and then particularly as this was received and influenced Russian social democracy, especially its grandfather, so-called Plekhanov. And this inheritance of Second International was then formalized in the early days of the Third International after the Russian Revolution, and particularly reached its sort of claimed orthodox form in Bukharin's influential 1921 primer, Historical Materialism, a System of Sociology. And in this worldview, in this version of Marxism, really a lot of the problems of vulgar materialism end up being reproduced. You have a fairly radical separation between the economic and the political, not just in their form of appearance, and even before capitalism. Between the base and the superstructure, there's an emerging sort of common sense that says that if something's part of the superstructure, then it's not very important anymore. And the base is the only place that you really need to look. You also start to get this problem of, especially with the pre-capitalist modes, reducing all these complex social systems to one single relation of exploitation. So classically slave, serf, and then wage laborer for capital. But if we look at the 3 volumes of Capital, it's very clear that Marx didn't just see capitalism as defined by wage labor and by that individual form. So there's a problem of this reification of what we can term an immediate process of production as characterizing the whole social system and the whole mode of production. And this is something that ironically Lenin would have balked at himself when he was working on the development of capitalism in Russia. He was very clear that there were lots of forms that looked primitive, communal, or feudal that were in fact capitalist because they were producing surplus value for capitalists. They fit within a capitalist world market. They're creating commodity relations. They just don't look immediately like the classic factory industrial workers that have been reified as the only thing that's really the proletariat. And the final thing that this Third International and eventually really formalized under Stalin, the Stalinist version of historical materialism that created a sort of poverty of reception for later modes of production theory, is the abolition of the Asiatic mode. Now, the Asiatic mode has plenty of racist tropes, even in the way that Marx and Engels are initially conceiving of it. It's an idea of a mode where the whole of society and all of land is understood as the property of the state, and the state is all powerful, and there isn't really private property as such. And that fits into a 19th century understanding of Asian, so-called Oriental state systems as fixed and as unchanging, lacking dynamism and all of this. But the very least that it has, and the reason why it became important, why it was important to retain, is a recognition that the Western European, Latin Christian experience with feudalism doesn't characterize the whole world's development. That there are these other developments which are characterized by precociously powerful state systems which seem to define the mode of production as such. And so that at least in that basic separation from the feudal mode, the Asiatic mode was important to keep. But Stalin apparently saw that the Asiatic mode was too easily characterizable as something close to the Soviet Union, and so wanted to abolish this potential that the Soviet Union could be interpreted as a classic Asiatic mode. And so we were left with a situation where there were 3 modes of production. There was the ancient slave, the feudal mode, and the modern capitalist mode. And implicitly and ever more explicitly, this was a teleology that every system had to pass through, a teleology that fit into the Soviet state's perspective, that the next step on this teleology was a one-party Marxist-Leninist state that would build socialism, and eventually you would get to communism. Now, it is important to say there were always alternative voices within the Second International and the Third International. Rosa Luxemburg in the her work on capital accumulation goes against a lot of and work on the importance of colonialism, the importance of unfree labor for capitalism goes against a lot of these. As I mentioned, Lenin actually implicitly goes against a lot of this. Also, Gramsci in the Prison Notebooks uses Bukharin's what's the word, primer on historical materialism as a kind of proxy for having a go at the whole vulgar materialist structure of Third International Marxism in general. And actually the first works that Gramsci works on in the Prison Notebooks is the Theses on Feuerbach and the 1859 preface. He asks for these in German and translates them. And particularly focuses in on the fact that if the superstructure is where we become conscious and fight it out, then the superstructure is in fact a moment of the base. It can't be separated, because if that's where we become conscious and begin to do sensuous human activity, practice to try and revolutionize our social system, then it is essential to the base. It's not just sort of an epiphenomenon, a mere like surface appearance. But the first real break from the dominant way for modes of production to be understood was affected by Althusser and the Althusserian school, which occupies a sort of slightly odd position within Marxism and Marxism-Leninism. Althusser never left the Communist Party of France, and really saw his task as one of de-Stalinizing within the previously Stalinist parties. So attempting to break from Stalinism, but never quite escaping this organizational framework for it. And that political experience of his is quite a good reflection of his critique of modes of production. It departs in quite radical ways from Stalinist mode of production theory, and yet it manages to ultimately stay limited within its form. But I think while I haven't set any Althusser or real Althusserians on the reading list, mainly because I think they've been superseded very effectively by the debate, particularly between Haldane and Banaji. I think it's important to recognize that this critique really wanted to go in the right direction. It wanted to avoid economism by the formula that I really like it, it's quite poetic, that the base determines the superstructure in the last instance, and yet the lonely hour of the last instance never comes, which is quite a nice sort of weird phrasing, but it's saying, it's trying to say that that this strict sort of economistic understanding just doesn't hold up. And then the other move that they make is to recognize that actually historical societies, what they termed social formations, which is the translation of, I think the German term is the Gesellschaft. Jules is going to correct me on that later, but I think it's that one they take as social formation. So they say that every historical social formation is an articulation of different modes of production. So some will have slavery, some will have feudalism, some will have capital, and so no mode of production exists in a historically pure form. You have these social formations there, which is an attempt to try and be complex with this, right? It's an attempt to be non-determinist about it, but it kind of ends up tying itself up in knots, unfortunately. So finally, there are a few debates just before I just set out why I chose these set pieces, and then we open up for the discussion. So a few debates that are particularly important post-war. There's the Brenner debate and so-called political Marxism, which emerges from a debate over transitions to capitalism. And in lots of ways, the differences between arguments over where capitalism emerges from, whether it's the English countryside, and so it makes sense to say England is the first capitalist country, or there was initially capitalism in one country, or whether you want to bring in merchant capitalism and the way in which, or even accept the legitimacy of the term called merchant capitalism, is how you, what heuristic value you place on circulation as a political and economic process, or whether you really focus on these single relations of exploitation, that wage labor becomes an incredibly important thing to explain how it comes about, how it creates higher levels of productivity and things like that. Also, in a category of social property relations is reflected in the 1859 preface as well. They have a bit where they say the forces of production, or to put it in another way, the property relations opposite to that, those relations of production. So it's sort of, that debate also shows how everyone keeps going back to these same texts to try and find some new way to break through. And then I think what's really important to emphasize is that modes of production debates were taken up across the decolonizing global south in the post-war period, because in each country it became really important to try and figure out what the relations of production were in their locale. And this is particularly important when we read Banaji as well, because Banaji was participating in a debate that had immediate political ramifications, i.e., should the communist government in Kerala, for example, expropriate peasants, because then they would create a wage labor force which would speed up the development of capitalism so that they could start transitioning to socialism, so that they could start transitioning to communism. This idea of teleology wasn't just a slur on other historians, that is to say. It was a real question over which people's livelihoods and the potential of creating a freer and more equal life were really at stake. And that played out in lots of different contexts, too many to go into, particularly Latin America. In Latin America, around the haciendas and these older colonial forms of land exploitation. On the reading list, there's a pre-capitalist modes of production, historical materialism edited volume. And you'll see that there are a lot of Latin American studies in there, or Latin American scholars rather. Also in Turkey, there was a big debate over whether Turkey was feudal. If you spend any time in the Turkish left, you'll see that there was a lot of agreement that feudalism was there. You'll hear people accusing other people of having feudal behaviors because these forms of consciousness were really understood as essential to how land relations were working. And you'll see Baktai's paper, which really influenced John Haldane. And then there were also scholars, particularly Japanese scholars, who were working with the concept of the Asiatic mode. And it's from this that Samiramin came up with the concept of the tributary mode. So all of that is to say that modes of production, whilst now it sounds quite esoteric, was the concern of millions of people actively in struggle for a significant portion of the last century. So the final bit is just these 4 chapters that I've chosen, explaining why I've chosen them. So I think, having said all of this, Banaji's critiques in the beginning, published in the beginning of History as Theory, notably some of which were actually published initially in the late 70s, so during these debates. I think the earliest was in 77. I think sorts all of these problems out very clearly. I'd like to hear your thoughts more, but I think in particular in the way in which he parses out completely this conflation between the immediate process of production or a single relation of exploitation and a mode of production as a whole. I think he manages to really sort it out. And then particularly, I think his emphasis on production as social totalities, rather than so you can't have combinations between the two. We should just think in terms of a social totality that is defined by the laws of motion of that social system, and the analysis of capitalist slavery in the American South is just, it's impossible to argue with. Some people continue to argue with it, but I think it's just very clear how this isn't the slave mode of production sitting next to the capitalist mode of production, but a capitalist form of slavery. And the other is his development of the tributary mode, and particularly the insight that in the tributary mode, the state is a moment in the functioning of the mode as a whole. So there's no separation between the political and the economic here. There's a debate over the separation between the political and the economic under capitalism. And certainly there's a formal separation in the form of appearance under capitalism between strictly economic factors and political factors. But there really isn't there isn't this possible separation that as is implied by basin superstructure. I find that very, very convincing. And building on that, then that's why I chose to include David Graeber's piece on turning modes of production inside out. Firstly, because I think it's quite revealing for historians to read him approaching that from an anthropologist's point of view, and pointing out how, and maybe for archaeologists as well, working in more limited, well, limited sounds derogatory, but like a more immediate context, a more immediate like material context, could see like how a mode of production as a heuristic just stops working once you get outside of these dominating state systems. And so he sort of almost as a throwaway says, well, that means modes of production are a theory of the state. And I think that's quite a nice provocation for us to try and build on, for a more libertarian Marxist rendering of modes of production, say theory of the state is a bit glib, but as theories of state systems, understood, meaning that the state needs to necessarily not be this sort of objectivist thing. And then Wood's attack on basin superstructure, I think is brilliant, even if I think she's a bit unfair to Nikos Poulantzas, and the polemical form sort of gets away with the piece at certain points. It really shows how this has been, this metaphor has been expanded to turn into a whole analytical mechanism that it really is heavier than a weight that it can bear. And pointing out the problems again in the articulations of different modes. Now there is some interesting history that has been done by Althuserians or people who are moving from Althusser, and John Haldane is an interesting example in some ways of that. He clearly sides with Nikos Poulantzas in his debate over the state with Ralph Miliband. And in some ways, Haldane's conception of the tributary mode as one big pre-capitalist mode is the logical endpoint of the Althusserian, Poulanzian conception of modes of production, where it becomes too difficult to parse these things out as different forms. And also more recently, someone called John Milios, who's an economist in Greece. He wrote a book called The Origins of Capitalism as a Social System, which is Poulanzian, Althusserian in influence, and has a whole section at the end talking about the birth of capitalism from the point of view of the Empire of New Rome, Byzantium, and Venice, and how these relations developed. So there is some good history from this perspective, but ultimately Wood's critique is exactly on point. This space and superstructure metaphor has long outlived what weight it can bear. And finally then, John's piece, I think is useful which comes from a workshop responding to Banaji after he published Theory as History, I think is very interesting for, well, largely from my perspective, really showing the necessity of Banaji's critique, because the alternative, as John says himself, is to arrive at a position that modes of production aren't very useful as heuristics, and that you have to start bringing lots of external things in. I think that for me isn't a very satisfying answer to go, well, this isn't a useful way of looking at things anymore, so we should take this language out, when other people like Banaji are showing that this language can be refreshed, and it is possible to do a critical study, say, of the tributary mode in the Empire of New Rome, which talks about laws of motion in the same way as Marx talking about capital. And also I find particularly worrying some of the potentials for a neo-Malthusianism, or put it differently, for a sort of new versions of environmental determinism to start coming in the way that John wants to, external to an understanding of the mode of production. Now, like, I don't know how far he would see it as external, but definitely in the piece, it's framed as a kind of external determination. And in his more recent work on Byzantium, he uses the category of resilience quite a lot. And I think that we can get that this is a very problematic term. And it's not necessary either for this external category, because we can talk very richly about how the so-called free gifts of nature become integrated into a mode of production and define the way in which a social system can be resilient or not. So my sort of proposition is that we can see modes of production as theories of state systems, both within, but also between a given polity and set of polities, as well as their respective classes, both the elite classes and the subaltern classes. And that these theories of state systems look at configurations of production, appropriation and distribution, as well as moments of productive and final consumption, which are composed of different but interrelated immediate processes of production. And one might be dominant or a definitive one, like wage labor in capitalism. But like wage labor in capitalism, that can be a dominance which doesn't actually require to be the most generalized form of exploitation. It can be dominant, for example, in the first part of the 1800s, in a period where it's an absolute minority of subaltern classes which are really exploited in this way. And their theories of state systems, which also include the relations of domination, the institutions, core state apparatuses required to reproduce this mode over time and place, and views that domination as essential moments of the mode's constitution. So it's not just that there's a feudal base and a feudal state superstructure, it's that the feudal mode of production presumes forms of state system that are opposite to it. And the same with the tributary mode, and the same with the capitalist mode, I would argue, despite the form of appearance which seems to separate the political and the economic in our own conjuncture. But finally, one thing I would say is important to bring into Banerjee's perspectives is the dynamic of struggle. And this goes back to the problem of the relations and the forces of production. If we're to have a non-teleological understanding of modes of production, which Banerjee does so much work to set us up for, then technological determinism, the forces of production so-called, really can't be understood as the driving force that move us from one mode to another, or cause a mode to disintegrate and other forms of social system which don't have states take their place. So I think Bhattacharya's article from the same workshop responding to his work to Banerjee's work is particularly useful here for saying, yes, but we need to put struggle between elite and subaltern classes centrally to this. And so from my perspective, that means bringing in the problematic of hegemony as a key aspect there.